Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Pleasure to welcome back to the program Elie Mystal, justice correspondent at The Nation, who is, I think, probably just as frayed. And I got to imagine if you're looking at the legal aspects of this stuff, it's overwhelming. And it does seem to be the point, doesn't it, Elie?
Yeah, I mean, Sam, by the way, hi, thanks for having me. It's like you spend your whole life training and building up an expertise, right? You learn things, you go to the schools, and you look at this document that we call the Constitution, and it doesn't matter. There's not. It's almost like I have like an existential crisis where there is nothing that I know that matters anymore, because what I know is based on a world that has rules on people that are acting with generally good faith to enforce those rules. And when none of that exists, man, I'm like a Newtonian physicist that's been dropped into the quantum realm, right? Like nothing that I know actually matters anymore. So that's part of the overwhelming part of it. I mean, and like you're saying, like, it's by design. This is how this orange jerk wants me to feel. Like, he wants me to feel defeated, and I'm trying not to give him that last measure of victory. But it's difficult because I can tell you, and I'm sure I'm about to, all the ways in which everything he's done is flatly illegal. But I cannot tell you if any of that is going to matter. Right. And that's wild.
Wasn't there a, and maybe this is, I can't remember, maybe the whole thing was apocryphal, but at one point, like, there was a famous exchange with, maybe it was Supreme Court Justice or somebody, and there was something to like, you and what army, or something to that effect, in terms of like upholding a Supreme Court edict. I don't know what I'm thinking of.
I think you're thinking of Teddy Roosevelt disagreeing with the Supreme Court decision, and kind of Andrew Jackson disagreeing with the Supreme Court decision, basically preventing him from killing lots of Native Americans. And Jackson said the justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
Right.
That's and it was a straight up like, I'm the president, I'm the commander in chief, I have the army, I'm going to kill these Indians. If a couple of judges in Washington want to come stop me, they're welcome to take up a gun and try.
Yeah,
and that was one of the few times in American history where a president just directly defied a Supreme Court order, and it didn't matter. He just killed the Native Americans. All
right, let's go through this stuff, because I think on some level, like, the dynamic seems to be the same, and the only difference is that we have a handpicked Supreme Court, 6-3 Supreme Court, that I think Donald Trump feels like this is going to vindicate, his claims. Let's start with the attacks on DEIA, actually, and then work our way through the firing of the NLRB commissioner and the EEOC commissioners, disabling both those commissions or bureaus, and this whole notion of the Empowerment Control Act. Yeah. But let's start with the DEIA. I mean, first off, like, I've been reading into what the DEIA EOs were from Biden, and this is not about quotas. No. It is, and it's not all about like race or culture too. It's also about economics.
It's about economics. It's about gender. It's about enforcing the American Disabilities Act. But Sam, I have a kind of a subtle or nuanced point about this, right? Ending DEIA programs is not unconstitutional. DEIA is a policy, right? It's a policy enacted by white folks, quite frankly. It's a policy invented by white presidents, Lyndon B. Johnson being the first, with an executive order that Trump has now rescinded. It's a policy enacted by white companies and white schools. This is not a policy that Black people or women or Americans with disabilities asked for. What they asked for was the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act. What we asked for was the enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. White folks decided that the best way to enforce the Civil Rights Act and the American Disabilities Act was with these programs. So now if white folks and their white president wants to rescind these programs, that's fine. That's constitutional. That's a policy decision. The question becomes, if you're not going to enforce the Civil Rights Act through these programs, are you going to enforce it, Don? What's your next plan for ending discrimination in government hiring, Don? That's the question that people should be asking Trump. And obviously the answer is that they don't intend to enforce the Civil Rights Act. They don't intend to enforce the American with Disabilities Act. And that's where Trump's actions are illegal and unconstitutional, right? So like, it's a little bit of a bank shot here to understand that like, ending DEI itself, that's not the problem. The racism and discrimination and bigotry, that's the actual constitutional problem. And that's what Trump is doing, right? So if you think about kind of a standard like workplace harassment lawsuit, right? That's in the Civil Rights Act. You cannot take hostile retaliatory actions against people based on their race. When he suspends every single person in the federal government based on them being DEIA, without even being able to define what that is, what he's doing is creating a hostile work environment for anybody black, brown, woman, or with disabilities, or for anybody who is perceived to be black, brown, or a person with disabilities, because it doesn't actually define what DEIA is. So that's the constitutional problem. That's the legal problem, not ending the program, but the racism and bigotry inherent in the way that he is trying to end the programs.
And so he's getting rid of the apparatus that provides for some measure of mitigating the opportunity for those problems to exist. Is that it?
Exactly. Like, again, the Civil Rights Act says that you cannot discriminate in hiring, right? The federal government is the largest employer in the country. It's also the largest employer in every single state. The federal government is supposed to be an equal opportunity employer. Now, again, you can enforce that. You can make that happen through having an equal opportunity commission. You can make the federal government an equal opportunity employer in various ways that you can come up with, right? But what you can't do is turn the federal government into a select preserve for only white cis hetero men, and that's what Trump is trying to do. The problem, Sam, and you already talked about his hand-picked Supreme Court. This Supreme Court, I don't think, believes that the Civil Rights Act should be a thing. I don't think this court believes the Civil Rights Act should be unconstitutional. We should be constitutional. We already know that this court doesn't believe the Voting Rights Act should be constitutional. Like, John Roberts spent a decade slowly eviscerating the Voting Rights Act from 2013 in Shelby County all the way through Arizona v. Brnovich, right? So like, he's eviscerated the Voting Rights Act because John Roberts has decided that racism has been defeated and that holding white people accountable to it is just being mean to whites. I mean, that's John Roberts's kind of internal monologue, I believe. So I don't know that when you sue the Trump administration under the Civil Rights Act, I don't know that you're doing anything other than giving the Supreme Court an opportunity to, if not directly overturn the Civil Rights Act, certainly greatly weaken and vitiate it. And that becomes the problem with letting Republicans control the courts that you and I have been complaining about for like 10 years now.
I mean, when you, in the course of 3 or 4 days, get rid of like the parameters in which you can, as an employer, the federal government and these different agencies, where you can make sure that you're not being discriminatory at the workplace, and then you get rid of the EEOC and debilitate that, and then you get rid of the apparatus within the Department of Education to make sure that none of that's happening, and you get rid of the apparatus within the Labor Department to make sure that that's not happening, and you also just undermine the ability of unions to go get redress. If unions are looking into that, you've basically said this is really like, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound type of situation. You've basically gotten rid of all the people who are redress and making sure that this type of discrimination is not happening.
If I apply for a federal government job while black and they deny me that job because I'm black, how in the hell would I prove that now? who in the heck would I go to now? Where would I take my claim now? Nowhere. There's nothing under the Trump administration. There is no apparatus. There is no process within the federal government to hold the federal government accountable to the Civil Rights Act. That is the legal and constitutional problem. And that is not something that Trump, MAGA people, and MAGA justices think is a problem. They think that racism in hiring should be okay.
And
that's where we are.
We should also say that is like one, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that was the first thing that they basically, that was where they launched their first assault. But if their secondary agenda is to make the government have
White
less
again?
people working for it, I guess, I don't know what to say, like, smaller. But if I am a black person, a brown person, a woman in some instances, I mean, the head, there's some guy who's like, I think the OPM lawyer is a self-proclaimed raging misogynist.
Yes.
I'm not being facetious about this. It's just I didn't have the room to pull this story. I was holding it for another couple of days. But if I am any of these folks, if I have a physical disability, I'm looking around and going like, they're offering me a buyout. Like there's and I'm going to take it. Like this is, the first people out the door are going to be people who feel like they have made a big show of making sure that all of the guardrails to make sure that I have a modicum of respect within the context of this office have been taken away. And they just, have some 22-year-old from the Heritage Foundation is now in charge of my department. I'm out of here.
Yep. And I now report basically to Stephen Miller. And I serve at the pleasure of a racist ghoul. I'm going to take the money and leave, right? Of course, when you then go into the private sector now, the private sector companies are, they are more than happy to get rid of these programs that they never really believed in or invested in anyway. Again, I go back to the issue that DEIA was never, to me, super effective, right? Like it was never the best way to handle the problem of bigotry and racism in hiring. It was the white way to handle bigotry and racism in hiring. It's what white people were willing to do. And so, I support the programs because that's the best white people were willing to do. But I don't think those programs were necessarily the best possible solution to the problem, right? I think the best possible solution involves much more kind of accountability for racist hiring. So I always think more in terms of like firing, in having control over who's doing the hiring and firing them when they're racist, as opposed to giving them these kind of easy outs to like, well, we got our black for the day for the quarter, moving on. Like, but this was the white solution. So getting rid of these programs, again, the programs are not what anybody that I know is fighting over. What people are fighting over are the civil rights violations and Trump's attempt to essentially undo the entire civil rights era. If you kind of go step by step through all of these programs that you're talking about, these were all spooled up in the wake of the civil rights era, right? As part of the franchise being restored to Black Americans after it had been taken away for 100 years after the end of Reconstruction. And they're just undoing it all. They're just the people who never agreed with the civil rights era have won. People put them in power, and this is top of their agenda, and so that's what we're seeing.
And we should say, John Roberts, this has been a
lifelong dream,
44-year-long project for him from the time when he was a young lawyer in the Reagan administration.
And people keep thinking that John Roberts is a moderate, and maybe he's a moderate on like international tax policy, but when it comes to racial equality, John Roberts has always been an enemy of Black people. John Roberts has always been an enemy of a pluralistic, multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy. He's never for a day believed in that. And that's where you get into the problems of Trump, of Roberts now just potentially rubber stamping Trump's actions. Now, I will say one thing one of the things that I try to remind people about the Supreme Court is that, yes, they're ideologues, yes, they're lawyers, yes, they're scholars, but they're also just people. They're also just like regular people, and they respond to regular people emotions and issues. And one of the things that I have learned that the Supreme Court generally doesn't like is to be treated like an afterthought, to be treated like they're already bought and paid for, even when they're already bought and paid for. And Trump's bluster here bespeaks of a man who thinks that the Supreme Court is already in his pocket.
Rubber stamp it, yeah.
Right. And that, again, at a interpersonal level, that might rankle some of the justices. And that might cause him problems down the road. But the other thing, Sam, and I think this is why it's so important to bring up the buyouts, let's assume in the kind of best case scenario that many or most of these orders or attempts to get rid of the Civil Rights Act fail. They'll fail eventually in the best case scenario, but that's eventual court order is going to come too late for thousands and thousands and thousands of federal workers who will have already been fired, who will already have been placed on leave, who maybe will have already taken buyouts because they don't want to work in a hostile work environment. And so just by doing this, even if it's eventually ruled illegal and unconstitutional, Trump has already won his goal of menacing and harassing Black, brown, women, and disabled Americans throughout the federal government. And there will be people who lose their jobs over this who will never come back.
I mean, the goal, just to quote Russell Vogt, who's is going to end up be the OMB, is to traumatize the federal workers. And, they'll have a couple of different flavors of how they're going to try and traumatize people. But this is, step one. I mean, if I'm a federal worker and in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whenever it is, the Supreme Court says, yeah, you can't do this. I'm just going to be like, okay, well, what's the next thing they're going to do? Mm-hmm. Like, there's no, they can keep them from doing this one tactic, but where's to enjoin them from doing the next tactic? Like we need to move. We're all relocating to, the desert in Arizona. That's where my agency's going.
Right? Like there's
anything wrong with the desert in Arizona, but I mean, if I live somewhere else,
it's a dry heat, right?
It's a dry heat.
There's all kinds of petty, like, I got to remember, this is Trump himself is probably one of the most petty people we've ever had in the White House. His entire administration is beset by small, cowardly, petty men. And so you got to think about what that kind of pettiness, how that plays out on the ground in the kind of office space situation, right?
Right.
We're talking about people who are going to be who are going to lose their staplers, right? We're talking about people who are going to be placed in a back office, given the crappiest version of work. And just, again, the whole point of the hostile work environment suit. Hostile work environment is not just somebody coming up to you and be like, hey, N-word, how you doing? That's not it. Like, that's part of it, right? But there are all sorts of different ways a hostile work environment can take place. One of the ways that I don't, and Sam, because your viewers don't know, I play a lot of video games. And so when Blizzard got sued, Blizzard, the makers of World of Warcraft, got sued, I read every bit of that lawsuit. And some of the allegations in that lawsuit about the practices and Blizzard's offices, one thing really stood out to me about how the male coworkers would go into the fridge and drink the breast milk stored and pumped there by their female colleagues who had just come back from maternity leave. And I was like, that's so disgusting, right? But it's the definition of a hostile work environment, right? It's the definition of making somebody's job untenable just by your male bro behavior. And so when I think about what's going to happen to these federal workers, for whatever reason, I think about the breast milk guy, right? I think about like those are the guys that Trump is appointing. Those are the guys that Trump is hiring. And those are the guys who think that they are now untouchable and can do whatever they want to their black coworkers or female coworkers or disabled coworkers.
Let's talk about yesterday's illegal thing. Now, I got to get more specific because there was multiple. The unprecedented firing of a National Labor Relations Board commission member. That's never happened without cause and without even like claiming cause. Again, this shuts down the labor board. It needs a quorum to function. Same with the EEOC. People that Trump appointed to the EEOC. Like this time around, they really know they have planned for this. But let's talk about the Impoundment Control Act. We played a clip of Donald Trump in 2023. Basically outlining what he was going to do. This came from Russell Vogt. It came from the Project for 2025. This is almost like foundational. There are two things, it seems to me. The Schedule F, get rid of all the civil servants. And the other is essentially defund whatever he wants to, despite congressional appropriation. Hopefully, I think by now, over the past 2 days, this audience knows that the 1974 Impoundment Control Act and the Train v. New York City cases, more or less around the same time, I think it was, both as a matter of the Supreme Court precedent established this and the statutory presence of it. And then, of course, just like an OLC memo in 1988 and also the Constitution, which says appropriation. We now know what that means. What is Trump banking? Is this just like we're going to make things very, very difficult for people as part of like getting, people to quit? Or do they think that the Supreme Court, have they teed this up? Like you watch cases, and for people who don't know, Elie will look at like little threads that build over the course of a decade or 8 years or 5 years. Somebody says the major questions doctrine 15 years ago, and people are just like, what the hell is that? And Elie's got that on his bulletin board and waits for it to come up again. And then all of a sudden becomes the law of the land. What's your sense of how they're going to respond to this?
Right. So I want to do both of those stories at the same time, right? Because the firing of the commissioners, that is something that has been building within Supreme Court conservative doctrine for a very long time. It's called the unitary executive theory. And it's this idea that the executive branch is just one person, the president of the United States, in this case, Donald Trump, and he can do whatever he wants throughout the executive branch with basically no other outside control, no congressional control, whatever. He can do whatever he wants. Everybody in the executive branch serves at his pleasure is the thought behind the unitary executive theory. And so the Supreme Court has been pushing that for quite a while, and they will let him get away with firing the NLRB guy and firing the EEOC guy. I just believe that they shouldn't, but I think they will. This Impoundment Act crap, that's a little different. Not only are we, as you pointed out, in direct violation of statutes and Supreme Court precedent, we are in direct violation now of the constitutional appropriation power, right? Like that is clearly given to Congress. And when we talk about things like major questions doctrine and, the Chevron deference and all those other things, all the conservatives are saying it under the guise of Congress has this power, the executive doesn't, right? So for them to kind of turn around and say Congress has the power, the executive doesn't, to determine how to enforce the laws and blah, blah, blah. But the president has the power and Congress doesn't to spend the money appropriated by Congress. I'm not saying that the Supreme Court doesn't have the craven hypocrisy to do it. I'm saying that it would be such a left turn, right? It would be such
it would be so craven and hypocritical. It would probably be one of the most, because all of that Chevron doctrine is basically Congress doesn't have has the ultimate authority and cannot even, in some respects, delegate a broad mandate to the executive. They need to be very specific about it. And to say that on one hand, and to say that when Congress is specific about giving money, actually what they're saying is that's just the ceiling. You can go from zero to whatever they say in terms of funding it. That would be just absolutely right. There'd be no law left.
So if anything, I'm more worried about this case getting up to the Supreme Court and the conservatives using it to strengthen their bullcrap major questions doctrine, to strengthen their anti-Chevron deference doctrine, to actually strengthen their view that courts, not Congress or the president, controls everything in terms of the interpretation of law, right? So like, I don't think the court will go for him. And my bigger worry is that the court, in going against him in a decision that will be praised by liberals who just don't like Trump, that the court will insert really dangerous and ultimately unenforceable language into that opinion that then gives us problems 5, 10, 15 years down the road, while everybody celebrates it because in the immediate term, it's stopping Trump, right? So that's kind of my intellectual worry. But here's the other thing, Sam, and this is kind of what I was trying to say at the beginning of our segment. I can tell you that what Trump is doing is with the funding is illegal, right? I can tell you that the Supreme Court is probably going to overturn it. Who's going to turn the money back on? Right? You were talking about how federal workers might take a buyout because they don't know what Trump's going to do next. Do you know how many organizations and institutions are reliant on federal funding that has now been randomly cut off? There are schools, HBCUs, that if this stands up for more than a couple of weeks, will not be able to make payroll because their federal assistance has been cut off, to say nothing of the thousands, potentially millions of people who will not be able to put food on their table if federal assistance is cut off. We're kind of focused on the domestic stuff, but remember, this also applies internationally.
Yep.
Trump has ended HIV protocols
and
globally. So people are literally going to get their HIV medicine today and don't have it because of this random crap that Trump did yesterday. So when you think about the full scope of what's been frozen, a Supreme Court order a month and a half from now saying, like, actually, that order was wrong, it still requires somebody to turn the money back on.
I've got some good news. Go
ahead.
Breaking 10 minutes ago. The White House Budget Office, according to Jeff Stein, has officially rescinded the order authorizing a federal freeze on grants. Now, I say this I say this with a certain amount of trepidation, because in 20 minutes we could read like, well, actually, not exactly, and so I have a feeling it's going to be one of those deals. But
it's good for Tennessee State to make payroll right now. But I actually went over on Blue Sky. I was talking about this yesterday. One of the actual problems here with sustaining a lawsuit against these actions is, as we just saw, they change every day. They change every minute, right? And so, like, how do you sue? How do you have, for all the, the stupid legal jargon terms, how do you establish standing? How do you establish rightness? How do you establish mootness when you're suing against a policy that is changing by the minute?
Right.
And because it's so generally vague, at any moment you can go to court and say, like, Trump can't do this. And then Trump can say, like, I never said I was going to do that. And you're like,
or we stop doing that and we're just doing something different. And then you got to go back and restart the whole process again.
Do not pass go, do not collect $200. You got to go all the way back to the start. Right. So like that's also part of the chaos. And that's the entire point of all of this. It's it's succeeding in creating chaos. It's succeeding in creating an environment where people do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. And that means some of the stuff will fall through the cracks.
And frankly, it is all about making a hostile work environment for everybody associated with the federal, for America. I mean, really, like, from every entity that relies in some fashion on the federal government operating as it should, which is, really everybody. And, short of like, there's some very wealthy people who operate outside of those things. And all the aspects of the federal government are largely encumbrances, except for their, the FAA, and so that they can fly into their private airports and whatnot. Let me just, the way that I deal with this is to,
drink,
hide my, drink, as you know. We've spent a little time doing that in the past, but drink and then over intellectualize as a way of separating myself from my emotions. So when you talk about like, and again, this is hypothetical, but tomorrow they could just actually, no, we rescind our rescission, and they just could do this like every day, every other day, Tuesdays and Thursdays we have cut funding. Monday, Wednesday, Friday we haven't. What when you worry about like that decision that on its face would appear to stop Trump from doing something like this, but basically plants a seed or further cultivates some vine or growth essentially within the law as to debilitate the federal government down the line, what does that look like?
Well, it looks like a situation where the Democrats, should they ever get their heads out of their ass and be able to win another election, it creates a situation where the Democrats cannot undo by executive order all the stuff that Trump did do by executive order. You see, like if Trump's, spaghetti at the wall, feces at the wall, just like a monkey's just throwing stuff, right? And it's going to be incumbent, if he ever loses power, if the Democrats ever take power, to undo a bunch of the stuff that he did, right? But if the court says, because we stopped, policies A, C, and 18 from Trump, that means we can stop all policies from whoever, Gavin Newsom. You see,
it's a power grab, right? By the Supreme Court, because they're not necessarily
to preserve the parts of Trumpism they like, but get rid of the parts of Trumpism they don't like, and debilitate the ability of Democrats to go back in and undo it all. But again, even that kind of worry is incumbent upon the Democrats, being allowed to have a free and fair election again, which I'm not sure that we will. The Democrats being allowed to win a free and fair election again, which I'm not sure we'll be allowed to do. And then the Democrat who wins the free and fair election sometime in the future actually doing something and actually spending all of their time using their power maximally to undo the Trump crap. I am still, it's funny, we're talking about the firing of the NLRB guy and the EEOC guy. Maybe I'm fighting the last war, but like Joe Biden got in and we didn't fire anybody, right? We didn't fire Chris Wray. We didn't fire Louis DeJoy. Like we didn't fire anybody, but Trump is out here, firing people who didn't even do anything wrong, just because they represent something that he doesn't like. He's firing people left and right. Whereas when the Democrats come in, it's all about turning the page and looking forward, not backward, and twirling. Like that's all we freaking do. Right. And so at some level, as much as I hate what I'm seeing with Trump, as much as I despise him and his entire, I hate him as a man, as a record label, and as an institution, like, this is what it looks like to use power maximally. And if Democrats ever have the opportunity to have power again, they better use it maximally.
Yep. And I guess it just, on that Supreme Court thing, the very sort of like ham-fisted version of this is, just as we said Trump could not infringe upon the Empowerment and Control Act, we can't also, this court also decides that Medicare for all, that is not, you can't have that. Right. By the same hocus pocus.
Right. You can't have Medicare for all. You can't have, we basically have gotten rid of the Commerce Clause. And remember, and you can't enforce the Civil Rights Act. Because it'll be, if you can end DEI by executive order, but now if you're trying to push it back through by executive order, no, that violates the civil, that's unconstitutional, because the 14th Amendment actually is there for white people, first and foremost. Like they're almost,
there's a myriad of ways of them basically forming that as a protective shield and making sure that this stuff never comes back.
Right. So it's just I warn. I've already been warning Democrats, when the Supreme Court starts releasing these decisions, especially the ones that go against Trump, read them very carefully,
because they're laying seeds for preventing any type of
even
reinstitution of this
Trump,
stuff.
Never forget that the court is not on your side.
Elie?
Yeah, it's been 10 days.
I was going to say, I didn't think we would get to this point for another at least 65 days or so, but here we are. Hope springs eternal.
I mean, look, people spring eternal, right? Like, I keep coming back to this. White people voted for this. A majority of white people voted for this, and large minorities of Latinos, and other racial and ethnic groups voted for this. A third of people stayed home and didn't vote at all. And so now people are getting what they asked for, and I hope they don't like it. I hope they don't like it.
I worry that we don't really have a connection, that there hasn't been enough done by, Chuck Schumer gets up and says, you're defunding the police. I feel like that's a little bit insufficient for the moment. Maybe there's a reason why, if the leader of the Democratic Party, right? He's the leader of the Democratic Party right now. He's the most senior Democratic leader we have, is not explaining to people the relationship between government operating and things that impact them on a daily basis, except for the police.
Democrats really have to wean themselves off of wordplay as if that is good politics, right? They have to really get over themselves, that turning them around on them doesn't freaking matter. Nobody cares that you're now using one of their lines against them. They care that Trump is using power and Democrats seem powerless to stop him. It's Chuck Schumer saying, now you're defunding the police.
What
it's
percentage?
Hakeem Jeffrey saying, but God is still on the throne. Really? Is he? I can't see him.
Right.
We've got to stop with these word games and start with actual resistance games, right? So one of the things that I keep saying, and we've seen this from a lawsuit from the Quakers, actually, with ICE going into churches, Quakers saying that is a violation of their First Amendment rights. I don't want Chuck Schumer standing on the Senate floor talking about, well, this thing with birthright citizenship, that's really bad. I want Chuck Schumer standing in the National Cathedral with 100 undocumented migrants behind him and saying, come get me. Come get me. Come arrest me, Trump, and we'll have our little court case. That's the kind of fight that I want to see from Senate Democrats and elected officials, not word games where we play gotcha with turning their own words and phrases back on them.
It's just stunning to me. I wonder if that 1/3 that stayed home, the reason why was because they felt there wasn't enough police on the streets. I suspect that's not the case. But Elie Mystal, we will, assuming we're both here, in the next couple of months, we will check in with you again. Good luck. I imagine there's going to be a lot of gaming in your future, to cope.
A lot of gaming and a lot of reading really bad briefs designed by the Trump administration. I mean, as an aside for your listeners, trust me, one of the worst things about my life is that the next Solicitor General, the person who has to argue these cases in front of the administration, and so a person that I will have to spend hours and hours listening to, is John Sauer, who not only was Trump's lawyer for the immunity case, not only is he a horrible FedSoc person, he's the guy that sounds like this. He's got that problem with his throat. And it's I listen to this man for hours talking like this about crap, and it's gonna drive me insane. Good luck.
Enjoy you, man. Hang in there. Appreciate it. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.